growing edge. And you know, like when you're really ready for a change, when you know that it's time, and you're really feeling that in your soul, in your bones, you're saying, I'm ready for a change. That's the place where I was a few years ago. I'd been working with women who had experienced sexual, physical, emotional violence, and all kinds of abuse for over 20 years. I was burnt out. I couldn't be present anymore and hear their stories. I couldn't be there. I had heard hundreds and hundreds. And one of them, who I'm going to call Chris, told me her story. She was living with her husband, who was a doctor. And early on in their marriage, he had broken her nose with a sharp whack of his hand right to her nose. He never had to hit her again their entire marriage. But he would look at her across the room and do this wherever they were, and she would know she would have to change her behavior. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Chris in a few minutes, but also I had a personal reason for this work. When I was younger, as a teenager, I was 15, and I had gone on a date with an older man. I didn't bring him to the house. I met him downtown, where he took me out for dinner, where we had drinks and went dancing. I passed because of his age probably too. And he was driving me home to the West End, and we stopped and necked a little bit at this dead end. And then I said, okay, time to go home. He raped me there. And years later, when I was doing my own healing, I had to ask myself, was I doing this work with women and children who had experienced this violence to save my own teenage self? Maybe. But you know what? My commitment and dedication to end violence against women and girls was very strong, separate from that. And so I knew that it was time for me to change. But I didn't know how. So I said, I'm going to go on a personal vision quest. I needed guidance and help. And so I had done lots and lots of tripping in the wilderness. Dozens and dozens of trips. I'd been as far north as James Bay. I'd been in Haida Gwaii in the Pacific Northwest. I'd done trips down in Florida, the Saguenay, all over the Great Lakes. I had taken courses on wilderness survival and navigation and how to paddle. I had done a lot to prepare for this, but I'd never been for a week alone by myself. So I knew there was some risk, even with my satellite phone handy that I could call the Coast Guard if there's an emergency, even with my beautiful 17-foot seafaring kayak. There's still risk when you go alone, right? So imagine with me, this was about 5 years ago, and I put my kayak on the car and I'd driven up to Georgian Bay. It was in mid-July and it was like 35 degrees out. It was so hot, it was like, you know when it's really hot like that. And so I get to the put-in point, 6-hour drive, get to the put-in point at Georgian Bay and get my kayak off the car and put it in the water, and I looked up and I saw the size of Georgian Bay and I was like, oh, I'm going out there for a week by myself. And I could feel, you know, that apprehension in my throat and my belly. But by the time I unloaded all my food and all my gear, stuffed it in all the crevices of my kayak, all the little waterproof bags, and I had to drive my car and park it and pay for parking. It was several hours later that I was ready to launch. And it's like the apprehension had fallen away. I could feel like myself, like my soul was singing. And as I, you know, that tricky part where you get in the kayak and start paddling, and as I launched into the waves, you know who I thought of? It was Chris, the doctor's wife from earlier. She had told me in our time together that she was ready to leave. And so she chose to leave that lifestyle and that marriage after many years, she moved into a basement apartment on welfare until the finances got settled. That, if you've ever taken, and I would bet that most of the women here have taken some kind of risk, little, big, a step into the unknown. And so I was holding Chris in my heart as I launched out on my solo trip, my personal vision quest. So the first few days it was like really hot out, and I was paddling, and I would swim naked every afternoon in the cold, sharp waters of Georgian Bay. It was really fun. And I was on this series of islands out. It was pretty wild and lovely. I wasn't seeing anyone by the third day. It was just so beautiful. The fourth day, oh no, I forgot to tell you something. At the nights, I would lie on the rocks that were still warm from the sun, and I would look up at the stars, the gazillion stars. And that astonishment at how vast this universe is, and how tiny we are, how small, our lives do not get too swept up. And sometimes I would lie there and I could find the Big Dipper, and I could find the North Star, Stella Polaris. And it would really soothe me because the North Star is there in the same place every night. So there was something really reassuring about that. And then, of course, I couldn't wax philosophical too long because those little tiny mosquitoes would come and eat me up, and I would have to flee to my tent and get in there. So on the fourth day, I'm camped on this little series of islands. I'm on this little tiny sandy beach, which is rare in Georgian Bay. My tent's already set up. I paddle early in the morning when it's calm because the wind always comes up around noon. So I'm sitting eating my lunch, and I look up and there's this band of black clouds on the horizon coming towards me. I leapt up. It's like, oh yeah, I can finish my lunch. So I finished my lunch, and then I drag my kayak up and I fill it with all the food and seal it tight and turn it over. I'm moving quickly, even though I can see it's a long way away, but there was this sense of urgency. Check all the ties on my tent, pump extra water, and by then I could hear the thunder and see the lightning as it was coming towards me. And I was like, uh-oh. By the time the tsunami of rain arrived, I was safe in my tent. And I pulled out, this was my guide that I brought with me. Finding Your Own North Star, Claiming the Life You Were Meant to Live, by Martha Beck. Has anyone heard of this book? A few people are nodding. Pretty awesome. And it was so dark that afternoon when I got in the tent that I had to use my headlamp to read. And the first thing I read about is, find your North Star, set your internal compass for where you want to go. And I said, I'm ready for this change. My soul's longing for change, but I don't know how it's going to come or what it's going to look like. And so Beck talks about letting go of the old, letting go of old griefs and old sadnesses. Dreaming and scheming is the phrase she uses. And then creating your own hero saga, like your own Wonder Woman. And so she also says this thing, which I love. No one but you has the ability to find your own North Star. And no one but you has the power to keep you from finding it. No one. Isn't that fabulous? It's our own North Star that we have to find. So through that night, as the storm is raging outside and billowing, and sometimes I have to hold on the tent, I'm reading this book and working through it. And I came across this part. I was, filling out all these things, and she's got all this workbook thing. My mom had died a few years earlier, and we had had a difficult relationship. She was feisty and fun, but we did not have an easy relationship. And part of the process is Are you standing because that's 10 minutes?
Yeah.
So I had to face and let go that my mother was imperfect, and I needed to accept that my own imperfection as a teenager, how difficult I was, as well as accepting that my mother was imperfect. So during that storm and that night, when it was time in the morning, I unzipped the tent and poked my nose out, and it was so still. There was this damage from the storm, you know, but there was this mist on the water. It was probably 5 a.m. And I thought again of Chris and all the women, each of us here, and all the women and men in the world who have taken risks, who have stepped into the world in a way that calls their heart. And I went back and did some more research, and I wanted to guide people through their transformative change. And so today I invite you to take a risk in this 2019. What is it for you that's calling you? Join me in this path of saying, where's my North Star? What's my compass telling me to do? To listen to your soul's longing. To take your own hero's journey and follow your longing to be in who you are. Thanks.